Welcome back, everybody. Our second week of discussing 7 weeks of Advent. This week, as I had said last week, sort of the model of this is we'll do a little bit of talking about Advent itself, and then a little bit where we will talk about one of the texts from the previous Sunday. For a little while, that'll be the Gospels, but once we get into December, we might be looking at some of the prophecies. But who doesn't want to pass up a little more uh, um, study of these texts that Jesus has been giving us the last few weeks? So this week, I just want us to remember, for those that can see the screen, this sort of circular calendar that we're on. That about half of the year is about the story of Jesus, and we're just embarking on that part. And then the sort of second half, which is the summer fall time, is sort of our part of the story. But and I've twisted it a little bit here. We're really focusing here on the sort of end of the green season that you see here, and Advent is what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about specifically, we're going to talk about the Revised Common Lectionary, the readings that we use for each week, and what that has for us. Because really, part of why this has been such an easy transition from a liturgical planning perspective to transition to 7 weeks of Advent is that the readings are already there. I've changed none of the readings. The themes of the week, none of it has been changed. All we're doing is sort of changing the season in which we find ourselves. So I'm going to start out talking about sort of, quote, end times. This is a new category of hymns in our ELW. So when this book was published, they put in some end times hymns. But if you flip to them, and you don't have to right now, but if you ever get curious, it's sort of the 430s, early 430s. If you look to what some of the hymns are there, Lo, he comes with clouds descending, Wake, awake, for night is flying, On Jordan's stormy bank I stand, My Lord, what a morning, right? These are hymns that before ELW, we found in the Advent section. They moved them here to this end times section because they fit so nicely with the readings and themes that never actually show up in Advent. But again, like we talked about last week with some of the shadows and vestiges of the 7 weeks of Advent that we still experience, that's why they show up. They still show up in the lectionary. We never got rid of the stories, but they don't actually show up in Advent. And so we've created this sort of end times. And what that is sort of these 2 to 3 weeks between All Saints' Day, including the reign of Christ, or Christ the King, technically the last Sunday of the church year. All of the readings and the themes are about this waiting period before the coming Savior. It's about anticipation and waiting, but in a more eschatological, meaning end times, literally translated as end times, than we usually think of for Advent itself. Now, this isn't so hard for us to imagine because Christ's Ascension has a tradition of pretty appropriately keeping Advent. And so we understand some of that eschatological waiting, sort of the fulfillment of all things in the coming of Jesus. We kind of understand that. But very quickly, in only 4 weeks of Advent, it very quickly shifts from this sort of end times longing to the story of Jesus' family, the story of John the Baptist, sort of this getting ready for the baby, right? But during this end times season, these sort of 2 to 3 weeks at the end of really usually the last 2 to 3 weeks of November, we are called to contemplate not just the end of time, but our own end. So we start with All Saints' Day, the witness of those who have gone before us, showing us how to live lives of faith. And then we sort of end with this coming of Jesus, the story of Jesus' reign. Now, what I will say is, while these texts are about this anticipation and this longing and this yearning for the Savior, many themes that we think of for Advent, the November readings are more doom and gloom, because they are more this sort of end of all things, end of time, eschatological end. So they're not nearly as cheery as I think we would often code Advent as being. I think if we think about Advent, we think about waiting and anticipation, and whether or not we can put the apocalyptic stories that start Advent with the baby in the manger, we always think of Advent as sort of this hopeful, expectant, cheery, bouncy, we think sort of the bouncy Advent carols, right? And November doesn't always match, the November readings don't always match up with that. So let's see, I moved my cursor so I can't use my thing. So let's start looking at the actual lectionary texts themselves. Now, for those that don't know, the Revised Common Lectionary, which came out in the 80s, is an ecumenical production of most of the mainline Protestant denominations in conversation with the Roman Catholics, although they don't follow the same lectionary fully, that works on 3 years with focuses on either Matthew or Mark or Luke, whether you're in A or B or C, respectively. And what it is the 4 readings that you get on Sunday. So it's the first reading, the Psalm, the second reading, and the Gospel for every week, as well as 3 texts for every day of the year that isn't a Sunday. So you always have a Psalm, and then you usually get an Old Testament and a New Testament reading, sometimes the prophets, sometimes the letters, sometimes the Gospels, but you get 3. And the way it works is if you follow it, and it is found in the back of your ELW, if you have one of these at home, you can find the daily lectionary in here. But what it does is it basically takes the themes of Sunday and spreads them out, so that from the Thursday before until the Wednesday after any given Sunday, the readings are either leading up to or leading away from the readings on Sunday on these themes. And that's why I say it's about more than the readings in this season, it's about themes themselves. And you can kind of see that a little bit if you've been reading through the devotional that I've sent out last week and this week. The texts I pick from there are part of this daily lectionary. And so they have some of the same themes that either we heard on Sunday or we'll hear on the coming Sunday, depending on where you fall. So that's what we're talking about with lectionary, the assigned readings that I use for preaching, that we use for liturgical planning, that inspire our hymns and our themes and our prayers. So that's the lectionary. In ordinary time, Sundays are numbered. That's why they're ordinary, as in ordinal. And so what we're specifically talking about here is lectionary 31, 32, 33, 34, which are the last 4 weeks of the year. There are, every year, 34 weeks of ordinary time. If we start the green season late, we don't take readings away from the end of the year. We take them away from the middle of the year. But I'll talk way more about that at some other point about how that works. So we always hit lectionary 34. Lectionary 34 is Christ the King Sunday, is the readings assigned, and we will every year, without fail, hit that point. If we start the green season in the middle of July, we will hit lectionary 34. So these are the last 4 readings, the last 4 sets of readings in the year. Now, I should note, within these days, there is a possibility for Reformation Sunday, All Saints' Day, the Reign of Christ. There is the potential that feasts fall on some of these, so we don't always read these readings, but these are the weeks we're talking about. In the year of Matthew, that's the year in which we find ourselves. In the year of Matthew, here are what the last 4 readings are from the Gospel of Matthew that we will get on these Sundays. We get all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. We did not get that this year because that was All Saints' Day. So we read the All Saints' Day readings instead. We get the 10 bridesmaids. We get the parable of the talents. So we've had those 2 already. And this coming Sunday with Christ the King, we have the sheep and the goats. When the Son of Man comes in glory and all the angels with him, he will sit in state upon his throne with all the nations gathered before him. And he will separate them as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And that's also the, whatever you did for the least of these, my siblings, you have done unto me. It's that reading. So you can see how I changed nothing. We would have read these anyway. But when we think about the themes of Advent, the waiting, the anticipation, this coming of the Savior, these fit right in there. These are in those texts anyway. So something happens. There's a reason why I focused on November different from, these last 4 weeks different than the rest of the readings that we'll get for this season. There's a reason why I made that shift, because there is the Advent gospel switch, is what I've called it. So because traditionally Advent is the beginning of a new church year, it also means that we change the gospel of focus. As I said, there are 3 years in the lectionary, A, B, and C, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, respectively. Each year, these focuses are on their specific gospel. Usually we see it more in the green season, but we see this focus there. The year of Mark also includes a lot of John because Mark just isn't long enough. But we have this usual shift in Gospels, so that Christ the King will be the last Sunday that we read from whatever the Gospel is. And the first Sunday of Advent will be the first Sunday that we read of whatever the next Gospel is. So this year, that means that the reign of Christ, Christ the King, is the last Sunday of Matthew, and traditional Advent 1, for us, Advent 4 this year, will be the first Sunday of Mark. Now, regardless of what the Gospels are, there are some themes that are shared throughout this season. Usually, at least 3 weeks of Advent includes general stories of John the Baptist's family, Mary and Joseph and their families, but they focus on them from whatever their specific gospel is. So we hear more from Mark or more from Matthew or more from Luke about John the Baptist or Mary or whoever. And then we can talk about the Lenten season a whole nother time. But we have this Advent gospel switch. So we're used to hearing a new gospel on the first Sunday of Advent. However, for us, it's changing now in the middle of the season. I was talking to someone on Sunday, so I guess just yesterday, who was saying, "Oh, I feel like I'm really going to miss having Christ the King." And I said, well, we're still going to have Christ the King. You're still going to have the same readings. You're going to still have the same themes of the day. You're still going to have the same prayers. You're still going to have a lot of the same hymns, really. But when we shift it to sort of be in the middle of this waiting period, it kind of changes our focus on the reign of Christ as being this sort of eschatological thing for which we're waiting, rather than this sort of rah-rah Jesus is King. And sort of helps us to reframe it, but we're largely not changing anything for the day. It's just placing it in this greater narrative. So again, a reminder, we're talking about this sort of very beginning section here with the lectionary of sort of the end of the green, beginning of the blue, but we have now shifted from ending the green to beginning the blue.
Is the 34th Sunday always Christ the King?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I figured, but I was just, okay.
Yeah, so Lectionary 34 is the last Sunday of Ordinary Time, the last Sunday of the church year, the last Sunday of the season after Pentecost, or Christ the King.
Okay.
Your readings are going to be the same.
Okay, so there isn't like a separate set of lectionary for Christ the King Sunday. It's just that's it.
Yeah, let me just double check because I have it right here and I have my finger in the page. But yes, I believe that is the one. Yes, Lectionary 34 is the last Sunday after Pentecost.
Okay.
That's just what you have.
Okay.
Um, yeah, it's one of those weird later edition festival Sundays that, as we all know, I have my own issues with. But yes, so Lectionary 34 or Christ the King, always the same thing. And we'll talk for a minute on what those readings are.
Mhm.
So this year we are entering into, not today, but soon, we are entering into Mark's Advent, right? We are entering into our focus on Mark. It's a short gospel. It's the shortest one we have. There's only 16 original chapters, and there's no birth narrative. The first words of Mark are the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There was a man in the wilderness named John. That's how Mark begins. Mark is also the gospel of immediately. Everything for Mark is immediately. Immediately Jesus is in the desert. Immediately Jesus is back. Immediately Jesus heals somebody. So it's a very succinct gospel. But that doesn't mean that there isn't enough in there for us to get the traditional reading that we have on the first Sunday of Advent, which is always an apocalyptic teaching of Jesus. In the year of Matthew, we get the story, we get the teaching of one will be taken and one will be left, right? Two will be sowing in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. Two will be lying in a bed, one will be taken, one will be left, right? We have that read, that part of the apocalypse. This year with Mark, that's year B, we will have the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, but keep awake for that day. And then in Luke, we have particularly strong language about people will faint with fear and foreboding, but stand up and raise your heads for your salvation draws near. Right? So we always start Advent with one of these three options, traditionally speaking. So what we've done this year by adding on these 3 weeks of the 10 bridesmaids, the talents, and the sheep and the goats is say, okay, well, let's spend a little more time with that part of the story rather than just with sort of the family tree of Jesus, which, you know, when we have 4 weeks, it's 1 week of apocalypse, 3 weeks of Jesus's family tree. When we do it this way, we have 4 weeks of apocalypse, sort of this waiting for the end times, and 3 weeks of Jesus' family tree, which in the grand scheme of the Christian life probably makes a little more sense. That fits a little bit more with what's going on, since we largely find ourselves in those 4 weeks of apocalypse rather than those 3 weeks of Jesus' family tree. Now, what we will get on the Sunday when we switch to Mark will be from chapter 13 of Mark, which is an entire chapter that's called Mark's Little Apocalypse. It's an entire chapter in the shortest gospel that has all kinds of fear and foreboding. Now, that usually fits with Mark's worldview, but that's how that works. That's what we get there. And so we will be reading from that. It's always curious too when we talk about this Advent, waiting for Jesus, waiting for the return of Jesus. When we get the traditional 4 weeks, it's 1 week where we hear from Jesus himself. He speaks in the gospel. And for the other 3 weeks of Advent, Jesus doesn't talk. Jesus doesn't show up. Jesus is not even in the gospel texts for the other 3 Sundays. So again, we're putting Jesus back into this waiting period by drawing in sort of this, what we would usually think of as the end of the year, but making it the beginning of the year. So for the rest of Advent 2020, so that's us here, for the rest, I just want to sort of briefly let you know, give you a little heads up on what we're going to be using for our texts. So for the reign of Christ in year A, that's where we are, the year of Matthew, we get the sheep and the goats. If we're in the year of Matthew, we get Jesus before Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, which is from John, because again, Mark doesn't have enough content to fill 52 weeks of the year. And so we take from John. And then when we get to the year of Luke, the reign of Christ text will be, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise, right? Jesus reigning from the cross, sort of that model of king. This year, for what will be for us the fourth Sunday of Advent, we will hear Mark's mini apocalypse. In the year of Matthew, we would get the human one comes at an unexpected hour. In the year of Luke, we would get be alert at all times, praying for the strength to escape all these things, all of which sound apocalyptic, because they are. Remember, this is going back to how those start. So generally speaking, Advent, and I said this before, generally speaking, Advent 2 through 4 feature the same people in the same stories. So where we get this sort of beginning of this more apocalyptic end time teaching of Jesus, and it's somewhat different depending on who you hear from and what parables Jesus uses and who Jesus is talking to, it's kind of different. For Advent 2 through 4, on the traditional 4-week model, you get the same people in the same stories. Advent 2 and Advent 3, this year for us, that's Advent 5 and Advent 6. You always get John the Baptist. You get 2 weeks of John the Baptist, who is the voice in the wilderness, the fulfillment of prophecy, the forerunner of Jesus, the last Old Testament prophet, technically speaking. And so you get 2 weeks of him. And then on Advent 4, you always get the story of someone in Jesus's own household. Usually it's Mary, so 2 out of 3 years it's Mary. In the year of Matthew, it's Joseph, because Matthew likes Joseph, and Joseph actually has some interactions in Matthew that are not found anywhere else. So for us this year, let's look at what we'll be reading. So on Advent 2, we get John the Baptist fulfilling, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you." That's how John's introduced in Mark. In Matthew, we have John as the wild man. We get all those descriptions of John who wears camel hair and eats locust and wild honey and shouts and screams and wears a belt of leather and lives in the wilderness. Like all of that description we get from Matthew. And then in Luke, we put the story of John and Jesus in history. That's one of Luke's passions, right? Luke begins almost all of his original, the first couple of chapters of the Gospel of Luke, all of them start with, in the day of Caesar Augustus, in the 24th year after Quirinius was governor of Syria, when Pontius Pilate was governor, and yeah, all of that kind of stuff. And we think of that as the sort of traditional Christmas story. But Luke also starts chapter 3, where he talks about John that way and puts John in time and place. And so that's what we get there with sort of traditional Advent 2, for us, Advent 5. And we will discuss these more in depth as we get to them any given week, because that's largely what we do in the second half. I just want to sort of intro how these things work and how this season as a whole unfolds. For sort of more traditional Advent 3, for us this year, Advent 6, we get a second John the Baptist. You get John the Baptist twice. In the year of Mark, that's the one we're going to be in, that's the one we're in, Mark only says a little bit about John. So we have to take from the Gospel of John. Remember, we always augment Mark with John. And we get a whole, who are you? Are you Elijah? Are you Isaiah? Are you one of the prophets? Like who are you, John? And John kind of defends himself. In the year of Matthew, if you remember just last year, the second story of John the Baptist is John sending a message to Jesus from prison. So John is imprisoned by Herod, and he sends a message to Jesus basically saying, are you really what we're waiting for? Because I'm really not impressed. And then in the year of Luke, we have a second set of teachings from John. John does a lot of preaching in Luke. And this is the one where we get the "you brood of vipers, who told you to flee from the wrath that is to come." And that's what we get, is this sort of second set of John the Baptist readings. And then on the last Sunday, what is the sort of culmination Sunday of Advent? Traditional Advent 4, for us Advent 7. As I said, it's always a member of Jesus' own household. This year, in the year of Mark, we won't get John, we'll get Luke, and we get the story of the Annunciation. The angel Gabriel came to Nazareth, to a woman whose name was Mary. Greetings, highly favored, blessed are you among women. And we'll get that story. In the year of Matthew, as I said, we focus on Joseph's dream, which is to say, in the year of Matthew, we get the story of Christmas twice. It's the only year that we get 2 Christmas stories, because basically the last Sunday of Advent, we read Matthew's birth narrative, which does not focus on Mary or the angels or the shepherds or the stable. It all focuses on Joseph's dream. Joseph finds out Mary's going to have a baby. He plans to divorce her quietly because he is a righteous man. And an angel comes to him and says, no, don't do that. Take her into your home. Continue being a righteous man until she has the baby. And then, and then you can move forward. And Joseph does that and takes her into his home, and Jesus is born, and Joseph names him Jesus, as the angel said, which is sort of this complete role reversal of what happens in the other Gospels. But Matthew seems to like the men more than the women anyway. But so that's what we get. And so that's actually Matthew's version of the Nativity. And then in year C, as we would expect from Luke, we get the story of Elizabeth and Mary, the Visitation, Mary's song in the Magnificat, all of that sort of beautiful end of chapter 1 of Luke that really truly leads up to what we expect to hear on Christmas Eve. As the season journeys on, whether it's 7 weeks or 4 weeks, this is the general pattern. Jesus foretells the second coming. Jesus foretells what it will be like, what the waiting period will be like, and potentially what the actual coming itself will be like. And then it is followed by successively closer and closer stories of his family until we get his birth story on Christmas Eve. So that we start with John, who's kind of this distant cousin, and then we get John in this sort of more intimate way of being actually sort of an advisor to Jesus for a while. And then we get this sort of inner circle of Mary or Joseph, and their stories. And then we get Jesus himself. And so we sort of get this end times, and then when we focus on the family tree of Jesus, it sort of gets this closer and closer every week to Jesus himself. A reminder that, as we've said, the last 3 weeks of Advent, again, whether it's 7 weeks or 4 weeks, the last 3 weeks of Advent, Jesus doesn't show up in the gospel texts. He might be mentioned, especially for like the Annunciation, he might be mentioned, but he does not speak. He is not an adult. He is not teaching. He is not healing. He might be being conceived or being born, all very passively, but otherwise Jesus doesn't show up in these last 3 weeks. So that's where we find ourselves. That's sort of the end of our, that's the end of this sort of general seasonal stuff for today. I wanted to touch on the readings themselves and explain why, as you see how these readings unfold, these 3 weeks, these sort of last 3 weeks of the church year kind of fit this model. And I didn't have to do anything to change them. It's just sort of how it fits in the grand narrative. We just extended really the beginning of Advent with readings that fit. But before we move on to an actual text study, and look, I actually am keeping it pretty half and half this week. Are there questions or comments or concerns on sort of these lectionary readings, themes, why we switched based on these readings, that kind of stuff? And everybody should be able to unmute themselves. I have that marked off this time. Yes, John.
No, I just unmuted myself.
Oh, okay.
That's all.
Well, then...
It's very clear.
Well, thank you. Then, is there someone, whether you have a Bible in front of you or the reading that I mailed out in the mailer, is there someone that would like to read Matthew 25, 14 to 30? So it's 16 verses. It's the same gospel you heard yesterday, but it's always good to hear it in a different voice. Is there someone that would like to read that text?
I will.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, who?
Go ahead.
No.
Oh, no. Tom gets to read a lot. No offense, Tom. Who would like to read? Who was that?
I will. This is Mary.
Perfect.
Okay. You're on another screen. There we go. For it is as if man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and I gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, or on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from these who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Whoa.
Can I say I really don't like this passage?
Yeah.
Well, so let me first put this in context. This comes in the same context that last week's was. So if you remember, I backed up the story of the 10 bridesmaids to start with. When Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered them, and then he, for like 2 chapters, talks about what this end of the age will be like. So in chapter 25, he's continuing to say, Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps. And what he ends that passage saying is, Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour, for it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves. So again, we don't necessarily want to take these too far out of context. This is all answering those same things, right? So this idea of keep awake, keep alert, you don't know the hour. And then as I sort of touched on last week, and certainly this just yesterday, And then there's this, so what are we doing while we're waiting part of this too. So there's the looking to the end. That's what 24 is about. 25 is what will it be like, followed by what do we do while we're waiting for it, followed by, and we'll get this next week, we'll get this next Sunday, sort of the judgment of the sheep and the goats based on what you've been doing while you've been waiting. So to put things in perspective, that's where it goes. But this sort of chapter 24, 25 are some of the darker ones of Matthew, because you get this weeping and gnashing of teeth. You get this anger, or this seeming anger and punishment from Jesus, which we don't often touch on. Now, also to put this in context, this is chapter 25, and in Matthew, chapter 24, or sorry, Matthew 21 is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. These stories actually come during Holy Week. The stories that we get on the first Sunday of Advent every year are stories that Jesus, are parables Jesus tells, or teachings Jesus gives right before the Passion. These Sundays leading up to the end are always these stories that come from right before the Passion. So they come after Palm Sunday, before Maundy Thursday, while Jesus is hanging out in Jerusalem, and there's all these questions, and Jesus is kind of trying to get everybody as ready as possible. But also, I think in some ways Jesus is kind of talking to fill the time. They can get kind of rambly. The last few chapters of every gospel, Jesus gets kind of rambly. John is the most famous one, because in John, Jesus, that all the I ams, I am this, I am the vine, you are the branches, I am in you, you are in me, we are in God, God is in us, right? All of that kind of sort of cuckoo-ca-choo language is, that's literally Jesus' last sermon to his disciples after the Last Supper, before he's arrested, right? I get a little bit here in chapter 24 and 25 of Matthew. I get a little bit of this, like Jesus is asked a question and then just kind of keeps talking because it's comforting to talk. Because it goes all kinds of places. And so I wonder how much we take of it as actual teaching. You know, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, as much as it sounds like a good ending to the story. Jesus rambled on long enough and was like, and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But what I want to say is, now that I've rambled on a little bit more, and we heard this yesterday, we had a sermon yesterday, we've read it again. I want to start with questions, comments, concerns. I know, Elizabeth, you were starting to say you don't enjoy this text.
No, I don't like the weeping and gnashing of teeth, because it makes me think, okay, and I know we're supposed to keep awake. I know we're supposed to, like, and what do we do while we're, waiting for Christ? I understand that. But that's very anti-grace in my mind.
Well, Elizabeth, perhaps you don't fully appreciate how richly we all deserve the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Well, here's the thing. So here's the thing. You're not actually wrong, Elizabeth. These are some very law-heavy, we all are gonna, like we're all gonna go somewhere. But if we remember, these are the stories just before the Passion.
Right.
So we get all these teachings of Jesus where it is all about this, well, while Jesus is traveling, right? Jesus, the peripatetic prophet, is all about welcoming in the marginalized, loving the unloved, welcoming the unwelcome, right? Healing the sick.
And now he's seeing his end, and he's just kind of like...
And now we see his end, and he's trying to instill that there is still stuff to be done.
Okay.
Right? Like don't just sit around and think that it's just all going to be happy clappy, because that's not the way it works, right? There are consequences to our actions and our inactions.
Right.
Now, whether or not that means you personally are being held to your checklist of things to do, no. But I think that sort of in the ability he had, there are consequences to action and inaction in the world itself. And so and I don't think that's too much of a spin on the text. But we can say two things about grace. One is the truly grace-filled moment that gifts us grace hasn't happened yet in the text, right? So we don't have the crucifixion, we don't have the resurrection. So arguably that grace thing is, grace, Jesus doesn't mention grace. Grace comes from Paul.
Right.
It's still coming.
But so first of all, there's that. And second of all, and I've said this a bunch of times, I love it. It's one of my favorite quotes from seminary, is that Jesus is the best preacher of the law because he himself is the gospel, right?
Right.
So that I could not stand up and tell you that you are going to go into weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? Or whatever, because I don't have that, I'm just me, right? I'm there with you. We're both there trying not to go to weeping and gnashing of teeth. The fact that Jesus is there is but remember, there's always Jesus, right? And so yes, there may be weeping and gnashing of teeth as this consequence, but there's also Jesus that, there's Jesus. And so that's one of those other things for us to remember in the text is that when we don't hear the grace, usually that's because Jesus is teaching something.
Okay.
And Jesus himself is the grace.
Okay.
It doesn't stop there being weeping and gnashing of teeth.
No, it doesn't.
I'll say that. It doesn't stop there being weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Mm-hmm.
It just puts the weeping and gnashing of teeth in the greater narrative.
But do people of all times know that? Like
What
at
do you
the
mean?
time. So.
Oh no.
Does everyone understand that, especially at the time?
Well, so no, I would argue, I don't know that in the moment, for the purpose of the story, so if we're going to put this in context and say what, for the first hearers of this, before it was even written, right? So for those disciples to whom Jesus is speaking and talking about the weeping and gnashing of teeth, would they know this sort of grand narrative? No, they wouldn't. Why? Because Jesus hasn't risen from the dead yet. So everything Jesus says is very literal, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But again, when we put it in perspective, Jesus does a lot of instilling in people this need to continue to act in the world, right? I mean, the curious thing is, and Matthew's the one where we get the Great Commission, right? Jesus is going up into heaven and says, oh, by the way, here's the to-do list until I come back, right? This is where Jesus says, go therefore and baptize, teach, preach, right? Jesus gives us a pretty big, there's not a lot of things on it, but it's a pretty big to-do list in Matthew. And that's the last words Jesus has. As he's like feet up in the clouds, he's like, oh, by the way, don't forget there's things still to be done, right? So that there's still stuff to do. And I think that's one of the important things for us, particularly Lutherans, because we have this throughout history. This has been the challenge of Luther's teachings on scripture, right? This idea of law and gospel. One of the big struggles is we lean toward the antinomian, which means we lean towards there is no law, right? Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, so there is no law. We're all good with God, so we can just sort of sit in our pews on Sunday morning and then go home and not talk about it, not tell anybody about it, not invite anybody to church, not really have to do any work, not really have to, live in the world, not really have to love our neighbor, because I'm good with God and that's all that matters. And it's while obviously many of us on this call aren't there right now, that is one of the trends in Lutheranism and the children of the Reformation more generally, is this, I'm good with God, so I don't have to, so I won't. And what's very clear in the Gospels, and what I think we need to remember more and more, is that just because we're good with God and just because we know we're not going to be able to do it all or do it perfectly, doesn't mean there's not still stuff to do. And it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences in the world for our action and our inaction, right? And so while it may not be that you will go to the weeping and gnashing of teeth place, if you do or don't, if you do something wrong or don't do something you're supposed to do, that there will be in the world this sort of grief and sorrow because you didn't act. Well, more generally speaking, talking to all the disciples together, again, if we remember, Jesus isn't talking to an individual here, he's teaching the sort of community. There's still stuff to be done. And so I think probably that they didn't know that it wasn't going to have the dire consequences of hell. I don't know that that was necessarily the point, so much as there are consequences. Take this seriously, right? This is the take this seriously, listen up, don't forget, right? Highlight that one thing I just said is kind of where we're going for with this. And I would argue that that's probably a very true, because Jesus, while it is something, while the phrase, right, weeping and gnashing of teeth, while that is a phrase that sort of has come into the common vocabulary as one of those biblical phrases, Jesus doesn't use it a lot. He uses it a couple of places. Nobody else uses it. And it's sort of these punctuating the end of stories in this lead up to the crucifixion. And how that all works out, I think at least that's sort of a part of it there. So I don't know if that really answered for you, Mary, but I don't know that the original hearer's understanding that it was metaphorical or not quite as much as, but there's consequences.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Did Luther have anything specific to say about the part that I think many of us find probably the most disturbing, about from those who have nothing, what little they have will still be taken from them, and from those who have a lot, that the other.
I hate that part too.
So I'm sure, well, and that's, I said yesterday, these texts that we get are not easy texts. These last few weeks of the church year, or the first few weeks of Advent, depending on how you look at it, always pray for your pastor, because they're always tricky passages, because we get these teachings from Jesus that don't seem to fit any of the rest of the narrative, right? It's the one time in the year when we get this weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's the one time when we get this, to those who are given, more will be taken, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So right. To answer your question, John, did Luther have something to say about it? I'm sure he did. He was a very long-winded and very overwritten preacher. He was an academic who really had nothing to do but write. And so, I mean, remember, this is the man that, while in captivity fleeing his captors, decided to fill his time by translating the Bible, just cuz, right? So I'm sure Luther had plenty to say. Do I know off the top of my head what he said about it? No. I can look it up for you if you'd like, but...
Oh, that's okay. I'm just wondering,
but it is, but that is one of those tricky texts. But again, that's driving home that, but we can't give up on the fact that there is still something to be done, that our blessings are not meant to be hoarded, that it's not just about me and God, it's about how I use the gifts God has given me, right? It all fits into that narrative of, so do something about it, right? And if we think of this, right, so that for Jesus, if we look ahead, chapter 26, Jesus is getting ready for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And he begins teaching about his death, which is followed quickly by the Passion narrative. So in chapter 26, we start really the Passion narrative. So these are the last few things Jesus teaches before we get this sort of transition into the Last Supper. And so you can a little bit sense, I mean, I love to use divine imagination with reading the texts, reading it, as literature. You can figure for 25 chapters, you've been following a character who's been trying to teach people how to live in the world, modeling the love that he shows. And then he knows he's not going to be around anymore. And in this last chapter has this real push for, don't give up. Don't stop doing what I've been teaching you to do just because I'm not here, right? Don't stop what you're doing just because I'm not going to be here, because it still needs to happen in the world, right? And you can hear a little bit of the desperation, which, yes, I'm guessing means that there was a little stronger language around at the time, right? Don't you forget, there's something still to be done. So that it doesn't map onto all the rest of Jesus' teachings or everything else we've learned in Christianity, I don't really worry about, as much as sort of when we put it in perspective, it's really this desperation of a soon to be dying man to be sure that his legacy continues, that his teaching took effect. And that's really the part of the story that we're at. That's always how we end the text, right? If you remember back when I was talking about the lectionary text, Christ the King Sunday is the sheep and the goats, right? The coming of the human one who separates the sheep and the goats, or Jesus before Pilate, or Jesus on the cross. And the readings that we have before those are all leading up to that culmination moment. And so all of them are in this sort of last time of Jesus too, right? This sort of passion tide readings that we don't get during Holy Week because we're focusing on the actual Jesus event of death and resurrection. But Jesus does a lot of teaching that last week that he's in Jerusalem. And so when you put it in that perspective, you can hear some of this desperation of really wanting his teachings to take hold. And perhaps that means that the language got a little harsh. You know, hey, Peter, why are you in the back there eating an apple? You should be paying attention, right? Peter, like weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? Pay attention or there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. How many teachers have wanted to say that, right? Pay attention or there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? So it's sort of that, like, are you paying attention to this? I've been with you for think of it in this way, right? I've been with you for 25 chapters of little bitty writing on very thin pages. And you still are asking me questions about what it's going to look like when the human one returns. Like, what, you're still asking me these questions? Okay, well, now I got to be sure that this takes hold because I don't have much more time.
Right.
Now, again,
Okay.
I flavored that a little bit with literature and divine imagination, but that's sort of putting it in the time frame of Jesus. That's where we're at in the story.
Okay.
Would you say the talents thing is also similar to, like, don't hide your light under a bushel, that sort of thing?
I would put a lot of those in the same category, right? It's this, you have been given something, why are you hiding it away, right? You have been blessed, you're not spending it. Interestingly enough, I would also pair this, it's sort of light and bushel and kind of make friends for yourself by means of by means of dishonesty, which is also a teaching of Jesus that makes us very uncomfortable, right? Jesus tells us to be dishonest to make friends.
Yeah, that's a.
But again, it's this, when we think about how the talents were doubled, right? The talents were doubled because they were spent.
Right.
So if we think about this is the abundance of God being shared wholly, right? It's not like, oh, I'm going to put one in my pocket and spend 4. It's I'm going to spend all 5 and make back 10.
Right.
Or I'm going to spend all 2 and make back 4. Or I'm going to hide 1 and then I have 1. So it's a little bit that, it's a little bit dishonest, it's a little bit make friends by dishonesty, because if there's one thing Jesus is clear about, it's that, I would argue the whole story of Jesus is very clear about, it's this idea that Jesus doesn't mind being part of the culture, talking in the language people understand, using the euphemisms, the stories, the images, the means by which communication happens, the way society lives and thrives, using that to spread the message, right? It doesn't work.
Who he called,
Well, so look at who he called. Look at how he lives in the world, right? He's having dinner all the time at people's houses. He's going to the temple. That's the thing, Jesus never abolishes going to the temple, right? Jesus lives in the world as the world expects and just says, yes, but it's not just a flower. Consider the beauty of the flower. Solomon in all his glory was not decked out like this flower, and you are worth more than the flower. Like, right? I mean, so if we think about these things, Jesus, that's what he does his entire time. And that's the whole story of Jesus, right? God's love is too much to be contained, and we don't ever quite get it. That God's like, all right, you're not paying attention to other people. I'm coming down myself, and I'm coming down in ways you can understand. And comes down as a person, right? Mary, I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I just remembered that yesterday when this was being read, and I don't know if this is just how my mind works. I read this as the slave speaking truth to power. Did anyone else read it that way?
So there is a little bit of that.
What's that?
I said, so there is a little bit of that.
Yeah, he's like, you idiot, like you're a big jerk, man. Like you reap where you don't sow, you gather where you do not, So
That's not a way to ingratiate yourself either. So I mean,
right. But that's what I thought at first. And we also never talk about the slaves that are all over the place.
Well, so I was going to say, so I think that's a good place for us to let me say a few things about that. The first is, yeah, there is this weird standing up to the master in a way that that we often overlook that part. It becomes complicated considering a more usual, I wouldn't say traditional, but a more usual reading is God is the master. So are we really supposed to stand up to God and talk back about how God works? I mean, so it does become a little complicated. But I think what's important there is it's this idea of if you look at what it talks about, it is reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. If we put this in terms of the talents, of using our gifts in the world, of sharing the love of God, if whatever, we could tease this out a little bit more and hear some of these ideas that God's love for creation is not as limited as we think it is, right? So that if Jesus is talking to a largely Jewish audience, what they're hearing is God's love is for God's people who follow the rules and do what we say and sit, in this model. And if we spread this out, we say, well, okay, but there are other people that are part of this. There are other people who need the love, right? There's other places where we can spend this.
They're the crop that you didn't sow.
They're the crop that wasn't sown, right? So they are elsewhere that are all part of this. Now, again, is that entirely what this is about? Who knows? It's a parable. We can come up with something different every time we read it. So in the grand scheme of the narrative, I never focus so much on that, but it is true. You have this weird slave who doesn't do what he's supposed to do. He is absolutely going to end up with weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's how Jesus tells the story, right? Jesus intends in a teaching story for the one who held onto his talent and didn't use it, who spoke back to the master, to end up with the punishment, right? That's Jesus crafts the story. But I think there is something there to this idea of what do we do?
Yeah,
I think we can hear something different every time.
I made you 10 talents, and he made it for the master's really making out like a bandit here. The master to me just sounds like a selfish jerk.
But I mean, it's also like the slave that buried it is like the good son in this parable of the prodigal son, in that he complains that
right.
he's got it, the father is giving things to the son who went and spent everything.
Right, that's what exactly. It's like in my mind that he did a good thing by by saving it for him so it wouldn't be reckless. I don't know. I read it all backwards than what most people are talking.
Well, but see, that's the thing with parables. Perhaps next time this comes up in the lectionary, that'll be exactly how I read it. I think it just kind of depends. And I think particularly in our waiting time now, I think we do hear more often those sort of those calls of injustice, because that's the world we're living in right now. So we hear it and we see it. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with hearing that. I just think in the grand, for the sake of my sermon yesterday and for the sake of the parable as a whole, I think that never seems to be the focus of the story. Is like, oh, you talked back to me. It's oh, you didn't do what you're supposed to do. But it is true. Now about the slaves. This is, if it sounds even slightly familiar, you may or may not have figured out by now, this is the well done, good and faithful servant that we often like to think of as so belovedly quoted at things like funerals, right? Well done, good and faithful servant is what rolls off our tongue. The text in the Bible, in the Greek, is well done, good and trustworthy slave.
Of course.
Slave is different than servant. People made a choice to make us, who are generally understood as the slaves in the text, but to make them servants. And so we do have a translation as good and faithful servant in the King James, right? And slightly after the King James. But that what we have here in a true translation is slave, which there are different words in Greek for servant and slave. If Jesus had meant to say servant and Matthew meant to write down servant, they would have written down servant. They wrote down slave. And I think that's an important distinction that we often don't like to talk about. Taking out all of the racial aspects of slavery and talk about slavery in terms of our Lutheran identity, there is this, the one who is the slave, has less autonomy than a servant, right? Slaves are owned and do as they're told. That's when they're good slaves. Again, when we take out all of the racism that America has thrown in about slavery that really has poisoned our entire concept of race. But when you talk about slaves in this day and age, right, in Bible times, slaves was not race-based. Slaves were owned, did as they were told. Servants had some self-autonomy, right? They chose to work, still weren't paid, but they had some autonomy, right? There was some end date. They kind of were their own people. And so I think that's something that if a whole different time, a whole different year with other things going on in the world, I think that there's a sermon there, there's a text study there about what does it mean to be slaves and not servants? Do we really have a choice? Luther would talk about, right, Lutherans and Luther would talk about this idea that once the gospel takes root, you don't really have a choice, right? The gospel sort of dwelling in you calls you to at least consider your neighbor, because that's what it means, right? It's this sort of infectiously infectious, right? Drawing, tantalizing, tempting thing to love your neighbor because of the way that the gospel dwells in us. And so I think that there's something there about the slaves, but I would say more generally speaking, in the Bible, there are different words for servant and slave. If it says slave in the English version, in the NRSV, it says slave in the original text. They weren't trying to make it more shocking or less shocking. They are different words. Through the years, it's been softened because people were offended by or didn't want to hear it or didn't want to think of themselves as a slave. So we took it out, but the word is slave. Doulos is the word, slave.
I'd like to say something. Am I unmuted?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I think maybe the use of the word slave is important because it, for one reason, it makes clear or really brings home the fact that when the master gave them these talents, the money wasn't theirs to spend on themselves as they pleased. A slave does not have that prerogative. The the money was given to them to make use of for the master. And I think this is maybe, for me, I've always felt like this was central or important to the whole text, and also difficult to accept. But once I accept it, it makes other difficulties less difficult. And that is that everything I've been given is not mine. Nothing I've been given is mine to spend on myself as I please, but it all comes from God. And my responsibility to God is to make use of it for the furtherance of his kingdom. And when I look at it that way, then the whole to them who have much more will be given starts to make a little more sense.
Well pointed out, Tom. This is definitely a stewardship passage. But I do think that's a great way for us to reiterate the sort of slave notion, is that this is not the master's leaving, so he's settling his accounts and paying his servants, to whatever, right? This is the master's leaving the slaves, so they're still enslaved, they still belong to him, they are going to take care of his physical property, and now they're entrusted with his money property while he's gone. And that's why it's very specific, right? He entrusted his property to them, not he paid them. And again, there are different words for that. That is not a choice. That is what the text says. So I think that is a good point there too, Tom, is that this is, what are you doing with what's not yours, right? So already this money isn't yours. What are you doing with it? And I think at the same time, we can go back to Mary's question of, well, if it's not yours, why is it your responsibility to make more of it? Especially if you know that it was gathered in these sort of other ways than you necessarily approve of. So I think that there's a lot for us to say there, but I do think that that's a good, well pointed out there, Tom. All right, well, we are after 8 o'clock, and I try, especially for these late sessions, to not have us run too far over, especially in the evenings. Zoom can get tiring for all of us. But I wanted to just put out there, are there any last thoughts, questions, conversations before we say goodnight for today?
I have a question about the lectionary. You said
yes.
that includes readings for weekdays as well as Sunday?
Correct.
Okay.
So if you have your LBW, if you have your ELW at home, and you flip way to the back, beginning on page 1121, there are readings.
Okay.
And if you notice, they start on a Thursday. So it says Advent 1, Thursday, because that's the Thursday before Advent 1, the Friday before Advent 1, the Saturday before Advent 1, and then it'll say first Sunday of Advent. Then Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday, then it says Advent 2, Thursday. So the way it works is Thursday, Friday, Saturday lead up to Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday lead away from Sunday. And then Thursday switches back over again, as far as themes go. But it's all here. If you need help figuring it out, because it does get confusing, because in the back it turns into dates. It does get confusing in places, but it's in here. Also, you can just, if you are a person that can Google, you can Google Lectionary Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt University, the Divinity School at Vanderbilt, has put together the Sunday lectionary and the daily lectionary that you just click on the day and all the readings pop up. And so you can do that. And that comes with prayers and hymns and art and everything else for you there too. So you can just type in Vanderbilt lectionary or lectionary Vanderbilt. That's the Revised Common Lectionary with the text right there.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, John.
Oh, I just realized what you meant by that. Do a search on lectionary plus Vanderbilt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Because mostly because I think the official URL is like lectionary.vanderbilt.edu/library/blah. Like it's a super long
well,
one.
The search will find it. Yeah.
Yep. Lectionary Vanderbilt.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all. This is
Thank
always a
you.
joy. For some
Yeah.
of you, I will see you tomorrow. And for some of you, I may see you Wednesday. And if not, I will see all of you on Sunday, our third Sunday of Advent / Reign of Christ. And I will see you then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good
Take
night.
care.
Night, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Night.
Night.